Hello and welcome back to Wyoming Watch from the Wyoming Tribune-Eagle. I'm Noah Zahn, your state government reporter here. Happy New Year to everyone, and to kick off this new year, we are looking back at our 2025. This week I sat down with our managing editor here at the paper, Brian Martin, to talk through our top 10 stories from the past year. This list that we talk about was decided by our newsroom staff, and we also briefly discuss our top 10 sports stories from the past year as well. Be sure to stick around after that conversation for a roundup of local events this week, followed by a recap of some of our top headlines from the past week. But now, here's my chat with Brian. So now I'm here with Brian Martin, our managing editor, to talk about our top 10 stories of this year. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I don't know how long it's been since...
Yeah, it's been a little while, but thanks, Noah. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so we're just going to kind of talk through these top 10 stories of the year, and I'm not sure where you want to start, if you want to just start going through them, or if you have any comments about, how 2025 has felt in the newsroom, or maybe how you've approached things, or what maybe stood out to you this past year.
Yeah, it's been a nice, steady year of continuity. We haven't had too much either staff changes or things moving around. It's been an interesting news year, as always. We brought on, a new local government reporter, and you moved up to state government, and we appreciate your continuing to do the podcast and host it. I think it's been fantastic, and we've seen our listenership grow, so that's been fantastic. On the news side, some years are more exciting than others. This year was certainly a heavy political year, which I didn't expect going in, but quite a few things, as you noted in your story, were influenced by the second Trump administration starting off, and then the Freedom Caucus being in charge of the legislature. There were some significant things that we'll talk about that came out of that, but a little more political heavy than I would expect in a non-election year. We're certainly going into a different political time as we go into the second year of the Trump administration, and an election year that now has become even more interesting with what's going on with our congressional seats. But yeah, it was a pretty interesting year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in the past few weeks, like you mentioned, with the congressional seats,
all
that moving around. So that'll be interesting to...
We maybe ought to talk a little bit about how we choose these too. Mm-hmm. So we say at the beginning of the article that it's chosen by the newsroom staff, but I compile a list of what might be the top stories or things that are worth consideration. And this year our staff had a little discussion about whether we were going to include the notable deaths, because we had, I think, 9 of them that you listed in a breakout box there. Folks like Al Simpson and Dick Cheney and some other local folks that we didn't want to prioritize one passing over another, so we broke those out separately. But we get the list, we assign 10 points to the top story of the year, ask each person to do that, 10 down to 1, and then I just tally them in a spreadsheet, and whichever story gets the most points wins. So or gets, not wins anything necessarily, but gets the top position, and then goes down from 10 to 1, or from 1 to 10 in points. But we had an interesting tally. I was surprised by the number 1 story a little bit, but it's always interesting, and it's giving that point structure, I think, creates some continuity, where stories that might not be somebody's number 1, but is their number 2 or 3, also gives them a high point total. And so we end up with some consistency there. But yeah, we'll dig right into the list of stories.
Yeah, and I think a lot of how the newsroom staff vote on this is, less about, especially if our own articles are up there, less about which articles we're most proud of, but I think more, impact locally or statewide or nationally. And I think that's part of how we ended up with number 1, because of the national impact and how that's played out locally.
Right.
But as we talked about earlier, number 2 could have been up there. So let's talk about those first. The top ranked article or series of articles we had was Sheriff Brian Kozak signs the 287G agreement with ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and 25 deputies are sworn in. And so that series of stories was kind of how our county sheriff entered an agreement with ICE, and sort of the deputies didn't become members of ICE, but they have a partnership where they're able to work with ICE through their enforcements throughout the county. And the coverage just kind of followed how that started and how it's played out. Even most recently, some of our reporters went on a ride along, and we had that on the podcast last week. And so you were telling me a bit about how you could have seen number 2 being up there as well. Do you want to tell me a bit about that?
And not to try to expose the number 2 story as being something that's secret because it's already been out there. But number 2 to me was my top story, which is lawmakers advance proposals to eliminate residential property tax and increase the state sales tax by 2 percentage points. You know, I sit in and wear 2 hats. I'm the managing editor, but I'm also the opinion page editor for the paper. And so looking at it from the opinion perspective, we had a lot of letters to the editor that came in right after that became obvious that the legislative interim committee was going to pass or advance that bill. So, you know, it was my top choice for the top story of the year. It certainly, if it happened, would have a lot of impact, but it's something that hasn't happened yet. It's just something that's in a lot of conversation. I think out in the community, that might be the number 1 topic, more so than 287G, which it affects a large segment of our population, but maybe doesn't affect everyone on a regular basis. But I could see either one of them being 1 or 2. And so it was just the way it turned out this year. We might mention that the 287G podcast that you did last week talking about that ride-along was the most listened to podcast of the year. So certainly people were very interested in it. And based on that, it would certainly merit its position as number 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that'll be interesting to follow the property tax issue through the session as that starts in a little over a month as, you know, that bill to put forth a state vote to totally eliminate property taxes will be discussed, but also it's a shorter session. Right. I think only 21 business days, something like that.
Right.
And, you know, they also, the primary goal through that is to decide on the budget. Mm-hmm. And last year the supplemental budget didn't pass, so it'll be interesting to see how they prioritize those different bills compared to the budget as well.
The things you think going into the session are going to be the most contentious and get the most conversation sometimes disappear quickly in a budget session. So we'll see.
Moving on to number 3, we had, and also this is already published online. If you want to follow along or check it out when you're done listening to the podcast, you can do that. Our top 10 stories of the year. But number 3 is the Wyoming legislature passes bill to repeal gun-free zones in most public spaces, K through 12 schools, and others adopt policies. So that one was primarily covered by Ivy Seacrest, our crime and public safety reporter. And I think Hannah Shields, the former state government reporter, did a bit of coverage of that at the beginning of the year as well. But the bill effectively repeals most gun-free zones across the state, including in public schools. And it really stirred up a lot of controversy. Is that another one that you got a lot of letters to the editor about?
Yep, lots of conversation both before and after it passed, and then concern at the school boards and government bodies passing the rules. What's that going to look like? What are we going to allow in terms of people carrying guns in? In Wyoming, we're an open carry state, but you still have to have a concealed carry permit to concealed carry. So that was really what it was about, was that conversation as to, you know, do we want guns in all of our meetings? Do we want them at public athletic events? And I think the university excluded the events that include alcohol. So you can't take them to a football game, that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was an interesting conversation at a lot of different levels as a result of that decision.
Mm-hmm. And that's one that's, you know, I haven't been reporting on it as closely, but I believe it's still playing out as school districts are kind of crafting their own policies. Is that correct?
Yeah, most of them have the policies in place, and they're kind of evaluating this first year to see how it goes. But they almost all said that they would reevaluate after this first school year and see how it went and see what they need to change, if anything.
Mm-hmm. Number 4 is not related, but a tangential topic, I guess, of how the Air Force pauses the use of the M18 pistol after death of F.E. Warren Air Force Base airman, and other shooting incidents resulted in airmen's deaths and arrests. That was one that was really shocking and tragic that occurred throughout the year, and there were several incidents. There was an accidental firing, a misfire on base. The details are still unclear because it's hard to get a lot of solid details from the base on how these things play out. But a misfire and on the base, which resulted in that pausing of the M18 pistol.
But then we had so many other shooting incidents involving airmen, and that was what was hard. As I was looking through the list of stories, I wanted to kind of group that all together because it just seemed like one tragedy after another striking the airmen at the base. And, you know, some of them were parties that got out of control or somebody that was goofing around with and didn't pay attention to the fact that the gun was loaded and accidentally shot somebody in another room. I mean, it was just one thing after another, kind of a series of mishaps and things that were made for a tragic year for the base and things they had to deal with. So.
And then number 5 is one that has been going on long since before I was employed here. But Douglas Smith was convicted in the 2015 double homicide at the coin shop in downtown Cheyenne and sentenced to 2 life sentences without parole. Is that something you've been closer to for the past decade? Do you want to talk a bit more about that and what that means locally?
For sure. No. Yeah, it was, I mean, we knew the trial was coming. We didn't know what the outcome would be. This has not been an open and shut case by any means. This went unsolved for almost 9 years until Douglas Smith was arrested. And of course, he was the person who was the 911 caller and reported the deaths of the 2 gentlemen at the coin shop. And when they arrested him, it was kind of, they kind of treated it like this is an open and shut case. It's obvious it was him. This is the guy who did it, and we'll just get him convicted and that'll be that. But during the trial, it was more interesting to hear that there was a lot of different testimony that made it, threw in some doubt there. Obviously, the jury didn't agree with that, thought it was easy to convict, and then the sentence, of course, was going to be 2 life sentences. But at least it gives the family some closure. The Smith family and the Manley family, I know, have struggled during this time not knowing who it was, and so hopefully it puts some closure for them. But yeah, it was certainly a big deal when it happened during Cheyenne Frontier Days in 2015. So.
And Ivy noted in one of her more recent stories about it that Smith remains in custody but is pending a planned appeal, so that one may
not be done yet.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Could continue to unfold. Moving on, number 6 was one that I covered. It was the coverage of an event relative to national issues, but it was thousands gather across Wyoming to protest proposal to sell public land. And over the past year, I went to a lot of protests at the Capitol as a reporter, not as a participant, but and a lot of those specifically were organized more within local groups related to the Trump administration, right. just kind of general protests, protesting him, not really with a specific purpose, just kind of maybe specific policies or some things. But this one was the most focused protest I went to, and by far the largest. I think there were around 500 people there, maybe a little more. And it was in relation to whenever there was a proposal that would have a federal proposal that would have mandated the sale of millions of acres on public land in the name of generating more revenue for the country and also creating more housing. And people from both parties attended that, and I'm sure independents were there as well. And a lot of conservationists, just in the name of protecting access to recreation, hunting, fishing, all sorts of things. And it was a very impassioned protest, so I can see why it made our top list. I'm not sure if you have anything.
Well, as you said, it was kind of surprising because it was more than 500 people showed up on that afternoon to demonstrate. Senator Mike Lee from Utah, his proposal was controversial. I was kind of surprised personally that Wyoming's congressional delegation backed that 100%. This is very much a public land state, and so they had to know that it was going to be controversial. And of course, the proposal ended up being pulled from I think it was originally part of the One Big Beautiful Bill, or was around that same time. So not surprised to see Wyomingites step up and speak out about public lands. It's very important to them, but to see that many people come together for a rally was interesting.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because the protest was specifically about our federal delegation supporting that. And I remember the Speaker, Representative Carly Provenza, called all of the representatives and left a voicemail with the crowd chanting in behind her.
Yeah, interesting.
So moving on to number 7, this occurred not too long ago in October. The Wyoming State Capitol was evacuated after reports of a suspected explosive device. This one was another one that was hard to get a lot of information on. We just became aware that the Capitol was evacuated, went over there, found out that it was an IED, which was
improvised explosive device.
Explosive device.
Which to me just says we don't really know what it is, but it might blow up. We're concerned about it.
And later in the investigation, the Division of Criminal Investigation identified it as a deconstructive live firework munition with the fuse. So it was never really clear exactly what it was. It could have been something someone created.
Right. The strange part about that story is that somebody saw it on the state seal out in front of the building, wondered what it was, and then brought it into the building. The first thing that I would have said was, let's leave that alone.
Yeah.
Let's call a bomb squad or whatever. But somebody's like, oh, that's interesting. Let's just take it in and hand it to the highway patrol. And then they went, whoa, now we got to lock the building down.
Yeah, well, thankfully they were okay, and everyone was okay.
Yes.
There were no casualties,
No
just
injuries. No, everybody was fine.
an evacuation. And since then, the next day after that, the building reopened, and since then, 2 suspects were identified and contacted by law enforcement within a week after that. And number 8, moving on, is also pretty recently, whenever more than 100 neglected animals were found at a residence south of Cheyenne, and the owner was charged.
I think this is probably one of the most egregious animal abuse cases I've seen in my 27 years here, Noah. It was astounding to hear the level of detail of neglect and what had happened at that home south of Cheyenne.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I was out of town or something whenever this was all unfolding, because I don't remember it too closely. But do you?
Yeah, Michael O'Hearn, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's of course pleaded not guilty and is innocent until proven guilty, but 22 counts of felony abuse and animal cruelty. The good thing is that he turned over control of his animals to the Cheyenne Animal Shelter pretty quickly in the case. Wyoming's law allows the person, while they're in the criminal process, to retain ownership of the animals if they want to. But it was obvious that he was not going to be able to take care of those animals, and thankfully he did give them over to the shelter, which was able to adopt them out and reduce the cost. They were at one point estimating more than $350,000 worth of care it was going to take to rehabilitate and get those animals taken care of until the case might be ended. But thankfully, and the community, as always, rallied, and donated more than $200,000, which is always impressive how this community supports the animals. But they were able to get them all adopted out, and now he goes to trial, I think, in February here. So
yeah, February 17th is what our story says here. So we'll
see how that turns out.
Yeah, definitely. And the penultimate one, I just love an excuse to use that word. But
excellent.
For the first time in recent memory, the Wyoming legislature fails to pass a supplemental budget. That was back at the end of the 2025 legislative session, as we're on the heels of this upcoming one. But this one was covered a lot by our former state government reporter, Hannah Shields. And
the surprising thing there was that they got to the point they did, and then just finally reached an impasse, and neither side was going to give up. I mean, it really became a debate between the House and the Senate. The House had a plan, had a budget passed, and the Senate just said, no, we're not going along with that. And, they had all the behind the scenes negotiations that always take place. But when they came out and the Senate said, we just can't do it, we're not going to pass it. A supplemental budget is not essential. We pass biennium budgets in Wyoming, so every 2 years there's a budget passed, and the supplemental budget is just to make what the governor and others think are necessary adjustments, but they don't have to happen. The budget continues to be the budget that was passed during the budget session. So it was just unusual that, in recent memory anyway, that they weren't able to agree on something. And again, you can point to whatever side you want to point to in terms of not reaching an agreement, but both sides really dug in and said, we're not going to do it.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, you've been reporting and editing, working in the news industry in Cheyenne for a while. It says in recent memory, this hasn't happened. Do you remember this ever happening or becoming close to happening?
Not in my 27 years. It has not. I don't know whether it did before that at all. We hesitate to say it's never happened because we don't have proof of that. But certainly, as far as anyone could remember, there's always been a supplemental budget passed.
Mm-hmm. And finally, we'll move on to our number 10 ranked story of the year. Was Laramie County judge says state has underfunded K through 12 schools. That also came out around the same time in February,
during the legislative session. In fact,
during the legislative session, and that's one that has unfolded this year, especially during the as it's coincided with the recalibration year, as the state is working to rearrange the funding structure of how that works, and so those have definitely altered those conversations. But there's also been some pushback from the states saying that they aren't unconstitutionally underfunding the state. So that's one that I'm not sure how long that one will continue to play out, but it doesn't seem to.
At least through this upcoming budget session, for sure. I mean, whatever the recalibration committee recommended and whatever the joint appropriations committee goes along with, that's obviously going to impact the next biennium's budget. The question is whether that case has been appealed to the Supreme Court. We're waiting for the state Supreme Court to rule. That ruling could come out before the session starts in February. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that here in the next few weeks. But the decision did come out during the session last year, earlier this year. I guess as we're recording, it's still 2025. But the impact in the long run is state lawmakers always feel like they're funding the schools adequately. It's very few lawmakers that say, no, we're doing a bad job of that. So to get them to agree to something that's the new level, and certainly per capita, per student, Wyoming has one of the highest rates. So it's hard to argue in some sense that we're not funding it enough. But then Judge Froelicher said there were certain things that were not funded, including school resource officers, technology, those sort of things. So we'll see what that Supreme Court decision says and how it ends up impacting it.
Sure. Well, those were our top 10 news stories of the year. I guess before we wrap up, do you want to move on to sports really quick and just kind of talk about
mention a few
some
of those
the
sports stories? Obviously, it was no one's surprise probably that Josh Allen's jersey retirement was voted the top sports story of 2025. Like we did with the news stories, everyone in the WT Newsroom, as well as the full WYO sports team, which is 2 folks in Cheyenne, 2 in Laramie, voted on this. And so it was a big deal once it was announced that Josh would be coming back and visiting Laramie for the first time since his graduation, and that they were going to retire his number. Single game tickets sold out very quickly. They added some additional tickets, and it was a big emotional halftime ceremony on a game that overall was pretty lackluster and probably would have been lower attended, but it was great to have him back in Laramie and to be able to celebrate his accomplishments as NFL MVP.
You were at the game, weren't you?
I did. I went over for that one just to see him and to be part of that. It was a great atmosphere. A little cold that day, but not too bad for a November day in Laramie. But really nice atmosphere and people welcoming him home. It was really nice. And then, of course, in typical Josh Allen humble approach, he brought a young girl out and talked to her. She had survived cancer, and so he made a point to acknowledge her and her battle and to recognize her. So it was a really nice moment.
Yeah, like you said, not really surprised either that was our top sports stories of the year.
Right.
I haven't looked through this full
I can run
list
through this.
yet. Yeah, if you
this
have
list
any
if you
other.
want.
Yeah.
Number 2 was Hillsdale saddle bronc rider Brody Kress making history. He had his 3 consecutive years as the top, the winner of CFD in that event, but then he won a 4th championship in 2025. He's one of only two actually to do that. Earl Thode is the other one who's done it, and now of course if he gets a 5th, then he'll be in solo company there. So nice to see a local cowboy do well at the event, but in this case, he was an East High graduate and continues to do well, so that's great. We'll just run through the others. Sure. The Cheyenne Central girls basketball team won the state 4A tournament, and so they were the number 3 story. Allison Fertig from the Cowgirls basketball team was the Mountain West girls basketball player of the year, and she had a tremendous run with the Cowgirls, so it was really nice to see that for her. East High senior Liam Fox won his 4th consecutive state title. I was surprised to read that 33 Wyoming wrestlers have done that through history, but he was the 33rd. So to win 4 state wrestling titles in a row is an incredible feat. So Pine Bluff's football team made a repeat of the state championship. So they really had an outstanding run. Very few points scored against them, and they easily won that game. There was a record crowd for a wrestling duel in Laramie when Penn State brought their reigning national championship team. Wyoming only won 2 matches, but it was still a great attendance for them for that. And then the Central girls tennis team ran away with the state title for the 3rd time in a row. The Cheyenne Frontier Days announced for 2026 and going forward that there'll be another rodeo or first-time rodeo on Friday. They'll have 10 consecutive rodeos, and so that's going to be exciting for this coming year. And then the 10th story was a not-so-good one. The Cowboys football team continued to struggle. They were 4-8 on the year, and so They had high hopes going into the year, but it just didn't work out. So those are the top 10 for WYO Sports.
Great. Thank you. Much more succinct than my my run through of the top 10 news stories. And I guess the last thing I wanted to talk to you about was you have an editorial running. When is that running?
Yeah, it's running this Saturday, so tomorrow as you're listening to this, if you're listening to it on Friday. The editorial board decided to look ahead to 2026 and some of the things that we're looking forward to, a couple of things we might not be anticipating as much, but there are some things that we're definitely looking forward to. So obviously we mentioned Cheyenne Frontier Days, but the big deal there is it's the year of the American Indian. We're going to open a brand new Morningstar Indian Village, which will be fantastic. I've been watching it going up on the east side of Frontier Park, and that's going to be a great addition to the park. Some of the other things that we mentioned, of course, is an election year, so there'll be a 6-penny sales tax election in August. We're looking forward to the hiking trails finally opening out on the Belvoir Ranch this year. A lot of attention was paid to the big mural off of Story Boulevard that was painted on the water tower. They're going to paint the other one this year, and that'll get a lot of attention. And then late this year, we had an announcement that the Maury and Bonnie Brown Foundation had bought the former Outlaw Saloon location, that they're going to build a rec center there. So we expect to see that getting started. Statewide, there's a few things, including the legislative session, which we'll have a lot more to say about as an editorial board here in the next few weeks. And then we'll head into an election year that we're just hoping that all the candidates keep it positive, focus on the issues, don't get down in the mud like happens in a lot of other places. And then there are two big anniversaries that are coming up. One's a sad one. The 25th anniversary of 9/11 comes up on September 11th of 26, and then more positively, the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is in 2026. And the events are already starting this month. There's a program at the Historic Governor's Mansion that we talk about. So lots to look forward to, and a couple of things that hopefully the politics doesn't overwhelm it. And I would just encourage our listeners to be as compassionate and supportive and understanding of other people and the differences, and to get involved in a positive way this year as much as possible.
Great. I appreciate you coming on and talking about, a look back at 2025 and a brief look forward into 2026. I think we've covered what we needed to do. Anything else you want to?
No, I appreciate the time. Thanks for doing it.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Now here's Taylor Staples, our arts and entertainment reporter, to bring us a roundup of some upcoming events in the area this week.
Today, January 2nd, there's a New Year, New Notebook event at the Burns Branch Library from 10 a.m. to noon, where people can record their resolutions in a decorated notebook, and it's also the first day of the second annual WYO Bounce Bash at the Event Center at Archer. The event will take place from 1 to 8 p.m. today, and will also be happening tomorrow from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m., and also on Sunday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Tomorrow, January 3rd, the day kicks off with the Winter Farmers Market from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the Depot, and afterwards there's a coffee and catalogs event at the Botanic Gardens from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Then, the Wyoming State Museum Family Day theme this month is Wyoming Winter, and the activities for that will span from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Later, there's a teen karaoke event at the library from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. On Monday, January 5th, there's a Valentine's meeting from 4:30 to 5:30 p.m. at the library, and an artist reset yoga session at the Lincoln Cheyenne at 7 p.m. On Tuesday, January 6th, the library has a sourdough starter event for adults with sessions starting at both 1 and 6 p.m., and a Brushes and Bites abstract self-portrait event for adults with sessions starting both at 1 and 5:30 p.m. There are also business inquiry drop-in times from 3 to 5 p.m. and drop-in career prep times from 4 to 5 p.m. for teens. On Wednesday, January 7th, there's a culture and craft session regarding Three Kings Day at the library from 4 to 5 p.m. and an intro to knitting workshop for adults from 6 to 7:30 p.m. also at the library. And lastly, on Thursday, January 8th, there's a teen writing club session from 4 to 5 p.m. at the library and an adult living room conversation session about finding stillness in the modern world also at the library from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. For more events, go to wyomingnews.com/calendar.
And finally, before we close out today, here's a recap of a couple of our top stories and headlines from the past week. Wyoming Secretary of State Chuck Gray announced Monday that he will run for Wyoming's sole seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. The announcement comes after incumbent Harriet Hageman announced last week she will not run for another term in the House, but rather put together a bid for U.S. Senate after incumbent Senator Cynthia Lummis announced she will not seek re-election for a second term in the Senate in 2026. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services announced Monday that Wyoming will receive more than $205 million in federal funding for the first year of the Rural Health Transformation Program. This investment, established under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, is part of a 5-year, $50 billion national initiative designed to strengthen healthcare in rural communities following the healthcare cuts that occurred because of the same legislation passed by Congress earlier this year. And finally, as 2026 is now in full swing, the state of Wyoming is preparing to implement a slate of legislative changes that will impact areas from healthcare to property taxes and new license plates to new anthrax outbreak protocols. That's all for this week. Hope you all had a nice holiday season, and thanks for sticking around with us here at Wyoming Watch for another year, as 2025 was our first full calendar year of doing this project since starting it back in July 2024. Happy New Year to everyone, and be sure to check back next Friday for more.